Cool. Well, y'all, my name's John Witte, and John and I were on the field together. He was my boss, Tim Teidenberg, and I lived across the border, Tanzania, Kenya, from each other. And anyway, that's how I got to Kansas here. Linda and I have been married 36 years. We have 4 grown adult children. We live in San Antonio, Texas. Just stepped away from being a pastor at a church in San Antonio to start a new initiative with a couple of friends of mine called the Astoria Project. And so part of what I'll do today will be slightly related to that at a certain point. But Dr. Greer, President of Southern Baptist Convention, has recently released a book called Who's Your One? Maybe you've seen that. You guys know what that's about. If you were in Ken's lecture this morning, he talked about that disciple making.
Andy Addis talked about that too.
Do what?
Andy Addis, I heard him say something.
Is he talking about it as well? Yeah, so you know what that means. It's like, who's the person that you're focused on and that you're just thinking about, praying for, that you're looking to speak to, and things like that about your faith in Christ. And so I want to talk to you guys about a guy named George Spiller that has sort of been my one over the last 3 years as I've learned to be a farmer and a rancher in the hill country of Texas. Now, I'm a preacher and a missionary. That's what I am. And you guys know that preachers don't know how to do anything except talk, right? I've actually had to try to learn how to be a rancher, and just how to be more effective in sharing our faith. I remember one of the places that I lived overseas is we lived in the northeastern corner of Uganda, and we were working with the Karamojong people. And I spoke Kiswahili already. Kiswahili was the trade language for Eastern Africa. But as a trade language, it was an easy language to learn. That's why it was a trade language. So many different people could learn it. Languages are ranked between 1 and 5. And 5 being your hardest, so like Mandarin Chinese is a 5. And Kiswahili is a 1. And so Kiswahili, even for me, wasn't that hard to learn. But I was struggling with my Karamojong because it's a 5, just like Mandarin Chinese. And it was like, well, I'm trying. So the way I did it is I would I'd work in class, but then I would make up these little conversations. So I'd come to Chuck here and say, hi Chuck, my name's John Witte and I'm trying to learn English. Could I talk to you? And he would say, oh yeah, sure, you know. And so I'd make some little presentation up. So one of my presentations was on a little talk about how the earth is round. Now, the Karamojong are flat earth people. Literally. They don't know that the earth is round. That's how remote they are, right? Sun sets in the west, it rises in the east, and they just think it's flat earth. So I had this little blow up balloon earth, right? Little ball. And I'm making my presentation in the Karamojong, and I'm feeling like, you know, John, I'm doing all right here. And I'm talking to this old man, this sensei, and he's got a thing through a brass bolt through his bottom lip, and he's got brass bolts through his ears, and he's sitting on this little stool, and women, I don't want to offend you, but they didn't wear underwear, the Karamojong men did. And so he's sitting there, and I'm telling him my narrative on the round earth, and when I get done, he says something to the guy who was with me who spoke English as well. And so I looked at him and I said, what did he say? And he said, that guy's a liar. He didn't believe anything I said. And that's how it works sometimes when we're sharing our faith as well, right? And there's some reasons for that. Some of the problems with talking about faith is, first of all, people tend to not trust someone who talks too much. You ever notice that? Like if someone talks too much, it's like, I don't know about that person. And you probably ought to be careful. So I'm going to talk a lot right now, but it's because I'm supposed to. Okay. Second reason is that faith, for a lot of people, tends to be kind of private. And when we're talking about faith to somebody, it can sometimes feel like we're prying into their private life. And you know you don't like people to pry into your own private life, and so that can be a reason. Another reason is that for some reason, everyone thinks they're an expert on politics and God, right? Whether you are or not, everyone thinks they are, and they know something about God, they have an opinion about him, whatever, and so they think they're an expert on him, and so don't tell me anything, I already got my own stuff. And then, I think another reason is that it just doesn't always feel natural. It feels natural to talk about your new dog, it feels natural to talk about, you know, the car you bought, or it feels natural to talk about this new recipe you found, but it doesn't feel natural to talk about faith. And so what I want us to do in our time together is I want us to try to figure out, how do we make talking about faith as natural as talking about the weather in southwestern Kansas? As natural as, you know, if you're like farmer rancher like I am, talking about your neighbor behind their back, right? Because we all do that. I mean, even though we're, you know, pretty good people, we all do that as well. So how do we make faith that natural? I think it's all in the approach. Just broadly speaking, I think it's all in the approach that you and I take. Linda and I bought our farm in 125 acres in the hill country of Texas, and we're actually down in a creek bottom, and we have a lot of good soil for that area. Most of the hill country in Texas has about this much topsoil on that much limestone, but all the topsoil from around, the hills around, have all washed down in our place, and so we have some really pretty good pasture on that 125 acres. The day after we bought it in February, a guy named Lee Angel called me. I have no idea who Lee Angel is. And he says, John, I heard you bought the old George Wright place. I'd like to know if I could, you know, run my sheep on your place. And I'm like, what are you talking about? I don't, to myself, I don't know you. I don't know anything about my place, really. I don't know the going rate. I don't know what sheep are going to do to my place. And so I just said, no, just no way. It's just too much, too fast, right? Well, George, who I'm going to talk a lot about today, George waited 3 weeks. His approach to me was completely different. He waited 3 weeks. He stopped by the house. Hey, I'm George Spiller. I'm, 71 years old. I've been living here my whole life. Everybody knows me. I was wondering if you'd be open to me putting 12 pairs of cow calves, 12 pairs, on your property. I'll pay you the going rate for pasture land. If you want, everybody knows me. I'll be happy to give you some references. You can check me out. He said, I'll do all the work. All you gotta do is let me have access to water, and you can keep your ag exemption at the end of the year. And I'm like, sold, right? Because I'm looking for a way to keep my taxes low. And so George's place was completely, his approach was completely different than mine, and George alleviated my fears. Simply by doing what I think farmers and ranchers do all the time. I think I heard this quote related to farmers, ranchers, because I think farmers and ranchers are kind of salt of the earth people. And so you can sort of smell a fake a mile away, And so there's that old saying, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me, right? And so I want to talk to you about how we can make our conversations trustworthy so that when we have them, people are actually willing to listen to us. And so these are lessons that I've learned from relating to George Spiller on my farm. That's why the class is called Who's Your One? And Lessons from the Farm. And so the first thing I learned from George is that I had to slow down. And that's the first thing I want to say to us when it comes to making conversations about faith normal, is just slow down. So when Linda and I bought our farm, I paid a fair amount of money for this place. Land in the hill country with water on it is just, ridiculously expensive compared to a lot of the rest of the country. And so I was immediately thinking, how can I make it profitable? Well, I was an idiot. I didn't know how hard, number one, it is for farmers and ranchers to make a profit to begin with. And then number two, I just didn't have the scalable size to really make any money on 125 acres. But I didn't know that. So I'm always thinking up ways that I can make money. And George would drive by. He had cattle on my neighbor to the south of me, plus his own. So he'd come by every weekend when I was there. And we'd talk and stuff like that. And I was constantly saying, hey, George, I got this idea. What do you think about? And then I'd float my latest idea of how to make money. And George would always reply, and he would say it just like this. He'd say, well, you know, the thing about that is, and what George was doing is he was telling me why my idea was a bad idea. What he really was thinking, God, this city guy is stupid. He doesn't know anything, right? But he was too nice to say it like that. And so George would just slow me down. And if you want to make talking about faith seem ordinary, one of the things you and I have to do is we have to slow the conversation down. Now, I think one of the reasons that we don't do that is because when we read the New Testament, and we read about what Jesus is doing, we read about the apostles in the book of Acts, what's constantly going on? Just every conversation is faith, 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 right? But you realize that we're being given a snapshot in the New Testament of what happened. How many years was Jesus a rabbi?
3.
What other career did he have?
Carpenter.
He was a carpenter. How old was he when his mom got mad at him for hiding in Jerusalem and not coming home with him?
12.
He was 12. You realize he was at his bar mitzvah, right? He was Jewish. He was at his bar mitzvah. He was becoming a man. And when he was 12, at that bar mitzvah, he, along with everybody else, knew there's something unusual about this kid. And Jesus knew, at least at that point, that he was the Son of God. He might have known it sooner, but he definitely knew it then, because remember, he said to Mary, what, Mom? Didn't you know I had to be about my father's business? Well, it's not Joseph. Joseph's stepfather. So, Jesus goes back to Nazareth, and from 13 to 30, 17 years, he submitted himself to Joseph and Mary, even though he knew he was the Son of God. Now, if you work with students, that ought to be like your number one, talk to students, is how Jesus submitted as a 13-year-old for the next 17 years to his stepfather. Well, in that time, that's when he's working with Joseph, right? How many conversations do you think Jesus had with people about carpentering? Bunches of them, don't you think? People are coming over, hey, can you make this for me? Well, what would that cost? Jesus is doing just what we do, ordinary conversations. But how many of those conversations are we told in the New Testament? None of them. Most of his conversations, he had many conversations that weren't about faith, but we don't see that because that wasn't pertinent to the message that the writers of the New Testament were trying to send to us. But nonetheless, when you pull the curtain back, that's a reality. And so one of the things that you and I have to do is learn to slow our conversations down, because even Jesus had lots of conversations that weren't about faith. And so if you're going to have conversations about faith that really work, you have to have some conversations that aren't about faith. They're just about ordinary, everyday things, recipes, the newest way to, grease your whatever machine or something like that. It just has to be ordinary conversations. So first thing is slow down. The second thing I learned on the farm is you have to build trust. Now, George and I got to know each other pretty quickly, because he was running his 12 cow-calf pairs on my acreage. And so George found out pretty fast that I was a preacher. And I found out pretty fast that George didn't like preachers and Christians. He really had no use for the little Baptist church in town. I mean, none. And he wasn't ugly about it, but anytime the conversation came up and it involved them, he'd always kind of spit. It just, he didn't want much to do with them. And so when he found out that I was a preacher, he really didn't trust preachers all that much, and yet I wanted him to trust me, right? And so the first task when you're trying to have good conversations about faith, your first task is to get people to trust you. And to get them, actually, I like to say it this way, is to get people to like you. If you want to be a more effective conversationalist about Jesus, about the faith, you have to get people to like you. Because one of the things we know about Jesus is that people who were nothing like Jesus liked Jesus. You remember the story in Mark chapter 2? Jesus has gone out, he calls Levi, who we also call Matthew, who wrote the first gospel. He walked by his tax gathering booth and he called him to be his disciple. And you remember what Mark says next happened? Matthew had Jesus over for dinner, and he ate dinner with a bunch of tax collectors and sinners. That's what the religious people called them. They titled them that. I mean, they felt about tax collectors kind of like you and I feel about an IRS agent calling us or auditing us or something like that. I mean, anathema. They didn't like them. And the religious people of Jesus' day just couldn't get over the fact that Jesus would sit down and have a meal with them. But Mark just throws in a little phrase there. He says there that he was eating with them because there were many of them who followed him. Many of who? Tax collectors and sinners. Many of the people that the religious people didn't liked Jesus. People who were nothing like him liked him. And so if you and I are going to be effective at helping people come to faith in Jesus, since he's not here today, and you and I are standing in his place, for them to believe in him first, they're going to have to like you and me. And they like Jesus. It's possible they could like us, but you might be fairly aware of the fact that people don't necessarily like us all that much. And so our first task is to build trust with people so that they'll like us. And we're going to say more about how we can live so that they'll like us in a little bit. The third thing I learned on the farm is that you need to start small. Start small, okay? So George would come by every day that I was there. He'd always come by every day to check on his cattle to my neighbor to the south. And he'd stop and we'd talk through the fence. I guess that's just the thing farmers and ranchers do, right? Like, it's just a wire fence, and we can see each other and talk right through it. So, you know, you're hanging onto the barbed wire, leaning on it, resting an elbow on it, whatever, and you're talking to each other through the fence. And so I would drop little pieces of, like, religious faith conversation into our conversations. But I'm telling you, it was very little. But if you want to have a significant faith conversation with someone, first of all, you got to have little pieces of faith conversation, right? Remember we said one of the problems with faith conversations is they don't feel natural. And so it has to become a natural part of what you talk about. But you have to start small, and you start slow, and you win trust. And so I would do that. I would look for any little opportunity to maybe even use the name of God, not in any kind of significant way. I would just look for chances to drop that into the conversation. George made it pretty easy to do that. The year we bought in February, that spring we had 100-year rains. I mean, it was unbelievable. It was horrible, actually, because everything started growing, and I didn't know how to kill anything, right? I mean, that's what farmers get up every day to do, is kill stuff so that the other thing you want to grow can actually grow. And so I had weeds just growing over my head. I didn't know the mixture for the herbicides. I didn't have a backpack sprayer. I didn't have anything I needed on my little place. And so George started saying to the neighbor to the south, he said, man, 100-year rains. It must be because that preacher moved in next to us, and he'd make jokes about it and stuff like that. But George said that for weeks, but it made it easy for me to actually, laugh at all of that. George, I don't actually pray that much. I mean, do you realize that, Because I actually don't. I don't pray as much as you think a preacher should. But anyway, I'd say that kind of thing to him. And that would sort of like surprise George, I think. But it put prayer, it put God, it put faith as a part of our conversation. And it's important for you to do that. You can't have a big faith conversation if you don't have a small faith conversation. And so it's important to start small. Fourth thing that I would say that I learned from George is I learned about the importance of being humble, all right? Do you know any proud farmers? I know you do by that laugh. It is possible to have a proud farmer, it is, but I don't tend, that's not my impression of farmers, is that they're super proud people. I find that people that are connected to the land and know how hard it is to make something grow and other things not grow, and how machinery can go wrong, and doesn't, you know, if you got cattle, they're gonna end up somewhere else where you don't want them, and all that kind of stuff. I heard one guy say he loved growing pecans, and they asked him, why do you love a big pecan orchard? He said, because every morning when I get up, I know right where those pecan trees are gonna be, you know? But you don't know where your cows are gonna be, you know? You got a bull and he's gone across the neighbor's fence, you just don't know that kind of stuff. So, I find most farmers are humble, but that's not always the case with us. So there's another guy who is an absentee landowner up there, and he's a lawyer from New York. And I'm not picking on the fact he's from New York, that's just where he's from. But this guy's been fairly successful as a lawyer, and so he thinks because he's had success as a lawyer, he knows something about everything, right? He thinks he's an expert about even things he doesn't know about. And so he had some calves, and one of the calves, the mother rejected it. And so he told George, he says, I want you to take this calf to the auction 30 miles away, and I want you to sell it. And George said, dude, they're not gonna take that single calf, it's too small, nobody's gonna buy that. You know, I'm gonna take it all the way over there, it's gonna take me an hour and a half to load it up, an hour to get there, come back. It's gonna cost you a bunch of money for me to make the trip. They're not gonna take it anyway at the auction. And the guy would not relent. No, I want you to take that calf. So George had to go and get all the cattle, he had to pin them up, he had to cut that one single calf out. This lawyer had no idea how much work that was to do that. Let all the others out, load that calf up. And George has to drive to Mason with a little itty old bitty calf in the back of a big trailer to an auction and then be told they wouldn't sell it. He already knew all that. And he knew that that's what was going to happen. And this guy who required that of him, his pride made George look bad. When you and I are proud, we're often proud to make ourselves look good, and it makes the other person look bad. A humble person makes the other person look good. And y'all, everybody wants to look good. Don't you? You do. We often don't talk about it, but we want to look good. None of us wants to look bad. And if somebody else talks to us in a way that either makes me look like I don't know enough, or makes me feel bad about myself, we're much less likely to want to listen or take or receive what that person has to say. And so we have to learn to be humble because we think we have a message that maybe this other person doesn't know about, but if I deliver that in a way that makes them look foolish and makes me look good, even if I don't do that on purpose, they are far less likely to want to receive our message. And so one of the things that George, I think, actually liked about me is that I knew I didn't know anything about being a rancher on my place. I ate cattle cake when I was just a kid with my grandfather. I knew that about farming. I knew what molasses cake tasted like, and you could eat it. I hauled hay and cut cedar in high school. I worked on a ranch in Johnson City in high school. And I have a really good friend who's a great farmer in Oregon where I elk hunt every year. That was my total qualifications to buy this farm. I don't know anything about doing this. But I knew I didn't know anything. And so I knew George had raised cattle his whole life. And so I just said, George, would you help me? I want to do this little, cow-calf operation. You guys know preachers. All we ever do is talk, right? We just produce words. And I thought, wouldn't it be nice to produce a few calves every year and put them back into the food process and actually make a real contribution to society, even if I'm only, producing 7 to 10. And so I said, George, would you help me? So he agreed, and I did whatever George said. And so he said, John, call Gerald at Jordan Auction, call him, and use my name, and just tell him you want 10 heifers, Black Angus heifers, and you want them to weigh 400 pounds. And I said, okay. So I called Gerald. Gerald is John Witte. I'm a friend of George Spiller, and I'd like 10 heifers, and I want it 400 pounds. Okay, John, we'll get them for you. So he got them, and they delivered them for us. He said, now when they get here, John, here's what we're going to do. You're going to take these calves, these heifers, and you're going to pin them up for a week. You're just going to keep them in a small pen for a week, and you're going to feed them. Because if you let them go, they'll go wild. So I said, okay, George, whatever you say. So I put him in the pen, and he was absolutely right. My pen's the size of this little room right here, and I was so proud of my 10 heifer calves, I'm standing there on the gate looking at them, and they're all standing as far away from me in the pens as they can get, and they all got their butts to me. They won't even look at me. This is how much they dislike me. And I'm thinking, I'm the good guy. I'm for you. I'm going to take great care of you. I'm thinking totally like a city guy, right? I don't know anything. So then, after a week, this pen is inside another 3/4 acre area that has grass in it. And so I said, okay, I'm going to let them out of that. And so they got out, and they got a little, place they could walk around, get to another water trough and stuff like that. And so I started feeding them in that 3/4 acres. And my plan was this: whenever I can get my calves to follow me around. So every time I went to feed them, I'd start up my ATV because I wanted them to hear the noise. And then I'd, Susie! And I'd call them in because I wanted them to hear Susie. And then I'd feed them, and all this. I'm setting up this thing. I want them to feel like that. So they come, and I started getting to where I could walk all over this 3/4 acres, and wherever I walked, my calves would follow me. Now this is huge progress in 2 weeks, right? From butts to me in the corner to following me around 3/4 acre. At the same time, there was a friend of mine, Joe Chapman. He had grown sons, and his sons wanted to buy some cattle as well. And they had like 600 acres. So they bought 20 600-pound Angus heifers. And Joe told his sons, he said, you guys ought to train those for a little while. We ain't got time for that. They bought their 20 Angus heifers, let them out into the pasture, and never saw them again. Until a neighbor called and said, hey, did you guys buy some heifers? And they go, yeah, we bought them. They said, well, they just ran through my fence. Totally wild. They didn't do anything. They didn't ask any advice. When I let my 9 out, my 10 out, after I had them, following me around, as soon as I opened the gate, they ran as fast as they could to the opposite side, 400 yards away to the next fence, and stood there. That's how wild they were. I didn't know any of that. I would have done just what Joe Chapman's sons did if George hadn't been there. And so, y'all, when we want to make conversations about faith acceptable to other people, it's easier for someone else to learn from us if first we have learned from them. Many times it's natural that you and I would come across as knowing something, being the know-it-all, because we have something to give them that we think they don't know about, and maybe they don't know about it. But whenever we're proud about that, rather than being humble, it makes it harder for them to actually listen. And believe it or not, one of the things that George actually likes about me is that I don't think I know it all. But there's someone in the room who knows that that's not the way I was. Because the whole time that John and I were on the field together in East Africa, I was the guy who thought I knew everything. That's who I was. I always thought I was the smartest person in the room. In fact, one time we did this little leadership thing called a 360. That's where everybody can talk about you in writing, without you ever finding out who said what. Like they're trying to find out, what do people really think about this guy? Everyone said, oh yeah, we think Witte's got great ability. He didn't listen to anybody. I mean, my relationships were like in the toilet. I didn't care about what anybody else said, because I was always the guy who thought I knew everything. And so, working at the farm, I knew I didn't know anything. I knew I had to ask questions. And George could actually be the expert. And because George was the expert, and I treated him with respect for what he knew, when the day came for us to have a conversation about faith, he was more willing to listen to me. And so I think it's very important for us that in our conversations, we have many conversations about multiple topics where we're not always the one who knows, we're the one being taught. So that when the day comes for you to maybe be the knower and to share something you know, it's easier for the other person to take. Fifth thing I learned is the importance of being patient. All right, every farmer knows this, every rancher knows this. You have to be patient. Socrates said, when the student is ready, the teacher will appear. When the student is ready, the teacher will appear. That means the teacher's always been there, but the student wasn't ready to hear the teacher. When the student is ready, they go, oh, there's a teacher. And so we have to learn to be patient until that time comes. So what happened to us is we're now almost 3 years into owning our farm, our ranch, and in the last 6 months or so, I decided, together with Linda, we had the opportunity, and we decided to step away from pastoring and actually start a new company. And so we've done that. I'm doing it with a couple other friends. It's called the Witte Project. And so one day, George and I was getting ready to burn 17 acres of grass land with mesquite, and I was getting ready to burn that. And George is driving by, so we're talking through the fence. And I just thought, it's time for me to let George know that I'm going to probably put my place up for sale. And so I told him that. I said, George, I'm starting this new, because he had noticed I wasn't around as much. And I said, George, you notice I haven't been around. I'm putting my place up for sale. And he was kind of like, oh, well, man's got to do what man's got to do. Well, then he drove down and saw Linda, and he stopped, and he goes, oh, I heard the bad news. And that was actually one of the best days of my life. He said, I hear y'all selling the place. Said, it'll be hard to get a neighbor as good as John. Okay, I'm just telling you, when John knew me in East Africa, nobody was saying that. Okay. And so George said, well, what are you going to do? And so I started telling him. Now, I'm going to tell you what the Witte Project does, but I'm going to tell you what I told George. If he's standing across the fence, and I'm on this side of the fence, I said, well, George, I'm starting this company called the Witte Project, and what we do is we help people figure out how life works. I said, we think everybody's stuck in life, they don't know how they got to where they are, and they don't know how to get moving forward, and so we help people do that. And I said, the way we do it is we use this template for story. Everybody's life is like a story. And in 1863, a German playwright by the name of Gustav Freytag diagrammed how story works based on what Horace said in 6 BC. And it's called Freytag's Pyramid. Now, I don't have a whiteboard, right? We're standing in the pasture with a fence between us, and I'm explaining all this to George. And he's just standing there listening. And so I'm drawing this out with my hands, but I'll draw it on the board for you. And so Freytag's pyramid that he did in 1863 looks like this. It's also known as the plot line diagram. Okay, anybody remember anything like that from English ever? Okay, and there's this event right here called an inciting incident. Okay, so I'm telling George, people are stuck, they don't know how they got to where they are, and so we help them figure it out, and it's based on a plot line diagram that's also called the narrative arc. And the narrative arc goes like this. People have equilibrium, but then an inciting incident happens. Equilibrium is the context and the setting for your life. But I said, at some point, this normal routine that you have during equilibrium, it gets upset by an event called an inciting incident. Inciting incidents are an unusual event in your life. They usually happen to you sooner than later in life, because we don't live in a good world. Somebody does it to you, it causes emotional pain for you, it can be a very traumatic event, and it creates kind of a false sense of who you are, a false identity in you, and it does this to everybody. It creates essentially pain. is what it does. I'm telling George all of this. And I said, then, none of us likes pain, and so we go about the rest of our life, from the time that this inciting incident happens, we go about the rest of our life trying to deal with the pain of our lives. And the way that we do that, is the most common ways, is we do it through addictions, through multiple relationships, and through accomplishments. And these things, two of them for sure we know aren't good. Addictions and multiple relationships we know actually aren't good for our lives. And so I call these worst way patterns or worst way behaviors. And I said what happens is that this kind of behavior or accomplishments trying to prove that I'm not this person in the false narrative from this inciting incident, these are ways that I try to deal with, mask, or mitigate the pain of my inciting incident. And I said, George, what nobody knows is that these two things are intimately connected to each other. I'm explaining this to George without a whiteboard. You can imagine. And I said, what happens is people get stuck in life. They know their worst way patterns, but they don't know why they can't change them. In fact, have you ever said, I don't want to be this way, I want to change, and you try, but then you can't? It's because you don't know what's causing it. What's causing it is your inciting incident. And this isn't based on my interpretation. This is how story works. It's how life works. And so the reason we can't change is we don't actually know what caused us to be the way we are to start out with. And so what this does to us is this relationship right here gets us stuck in life. We don't know how we got to where we are, and as a result, we don't know how to get moving. But story is all about movement and about the growth of the character in your life story. Story is all about character development. I'm explaining all of this to George, thinking he's not getting any of it, but he asked, and I'm pretty passionate about it, so I'm telling him about it, right? And so we have this conversation. I said, now, George, whenever somebody gets stuck over here, they usually get stuck as a villain. Now, every story has two characters in it. Have you ever heard about the protagonist and the antagonist? The antagonist is the villain. The protagonist in a story is called a hero. All right? Now, you guys help me right here. Give me a list of characteristics for a villain. I know you know them. Just go ahead and say it. What comes to your mind?
Anger.
Anger?
Selfishness.
Huh? Selfishness. Perfect. What else?
Pride.
Crime?
Pride.
Pride?
Pride.
Pride. Thank you.
Cruel.
Cruel.
Greed.
Greed. You're perfect. You guys are dead on. I'm always amazed at how, I don't have to give those, everybody knows, right? Okay, give me a list for the hero. What's a hero like?
Unselfish.
Unselfish. Or giving, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, what else?
Humble.
Humble?
Courageous.
Brave.
Courageous. Very good. Brave? Yeah, exactly. Might even be somebody who actually pays a price, right? You know, a price. They'll pay a price for the sake of somebody else. They'll do that. That's exactly what one is like. And so I'm telling that to George. And I said, George, when we have this inciting incident, there are a couple of options for how we handle it. Most people handle it as a villain. And then I remembered in this conversation across the fence that George has this problem with the Baptist church, right? He doesn't like Baptists. And he doesn't like preachers. And he's already told me that. I know that over 3 years. And so I connected the two. I said, George, do you know why? I mean, I know we've talked a lot. Do you know why you don't like all those people in the Baptist church? I said, it's because a bunch of them are villains. I don't know any of them. I just know people. And I know I was a villain for 32 years of my life. All the years that I was on the mission field, I was a villain. I was a taker. I didn't know it exactly, and I did not know why. But I was one. You just have to take my word, and if you don't believe me, ask Dr. Sapp. He'll confirm the fact that I was. Okay, I said, George, the reason you don't like a lot of those people, and the reason you don't like preachers, is because they're villain. And when I said that, I saw George's eyes look off to the south, where our southern neighbor lives, who's an absolute villain. His name's Mike Fritz. And I knew what George was thinking. He's thinking about Mike. He goes, oh yeah, that dude's a villain. Mike doesn't claim to be a Christ follower at all, right? But he's thinking about Mike. I said, listen, a lot of folks in church, just because they're in church, it doesn't mean they're heroes, it means they're villains. But you need to know something. I said, don't think because the followers of Jesus are villains, that makes Jesus a villain. Jesus is the greatest hero who ever lived because he gave his life away for our sake when he died on the cross to pay for our sins. In 3 years, that was the first time I said anything like that to George. We finished the conversation, started talking about my cows again, like, hey George, do you think they've all birthed yet? Or you think that cow there, you think she might still have a calf? He goes, I think you still got one or two. And then he left. George called me that night. George never calls me at night. He called me that night. He said, John, he said, he said, that thing we were talking about this morning, he said, you just really got my interest up. 5 times he told me, you just really got my interest up. He said, whenever I hear something and I don't understand it, I usually just dismiss it. But that thing you told me this morning, you really got my interest up. And then he said this. He said, I bet you never thought you'd convert me, did you? And I did just what you did. It's like, well, what? I'm not even sure what George meant by that, for sure. But I took it as a good thing, right? And it's like, you mean, George, this conversation that we just had across the fence with no whiteboard converted you? And I made one statement about Jesus that just because his followers are villains doesn't make him a villain. He's a hero because he died on the cross. That's all the gospel I've ever given you. I don't consider that quite enough. I don't know about you, but I don't think that's much gospel. So he said, have you written anything on this? I said, well, I'm writing a book right now, George, but it's not done. I said, but here's what I'll do. I'll draw something up for you. So I took the back of an old desk calendar, and I drew the plot line diagram on it, and I tried to remember our whole conversation, and there were more things than I put here. And I wrote everything out for him, and then I took it to his house the next morning, because I wanted George to remember the conversation. And I remember I specifically put on there, just because the followers of Jesus are villains doesn't mean Jesus is villain. And I put the gospel right there. Okay. I left it with him. I didn't see George for different reasons. I didn't see him for the next 3 weeks. And I'm thinking, oh man, the moment's passed, right? I mean, like we had this hot lead here, and it's gone. And I'm never going to get that momentum back with George. I've waited 3 years to have a faith conversation of significance with George, and now I haven't seen him in 3 weeks. Finally saw him again. He goes, man, that thing you told me, it really, it really made me think, it really got my interest up. And so I said, well, George, would you like, let's talk about it at some point. And so a couple more weeks passed. And finally, I was out there in the middle of a week, and I said, George, I'm here. If you want to talk, come by and let's talk. And so George came by, and for 2 hours, we sat on the front porch, and George told me his whole life story, based on Fred Tech's pyramid. I asked him, I said, George, just tell me, start when you were young, just tell me your story. And George told me his whole story. George is 71, and I'm 60. And he told me his whole life story. And I asked him a few questions about it, and he told me, he said, John, I've told you things I've never told anybody. That's a pretty significant conversation, isn't it? But it wasn't a gospel conversation. It was just George telling me his life story. And so I asked George a couple questions based on my experience with other people's story. I said, George, why don't you think about this and this? And he said, I need to do that. I need to think about this. So another 2 weeks went by, literally. And I'm out there again, and I said, George, what do you think about your story? I said, I'm here if you want, come by. So George came by, and he drove onto my property. George never drives onto my property. He just stops at the road. I don't know why. But this day, he drove into the gate onto the property. And so we sat down in our living room, and I said, George, how you feeling about all this since you told me your story? And he said, well, it's like this big burden's been lifted from me. And I'm thinking, well, that's how I felt when I got converted. But I'm still not thinking he's got converted. I still don't know that. And so I said, George, and he started talking about death. And I thought, okay, here's the time. It's time now to tell the gospel. I said, George, what do you believe about life after death? I've never asked him anything like that. George, what do you believe about life after death? He said, oh, I think that's in the hands of the good Lord. Well, I was kind of happy to hear that. You know, I didn't know if George had believed that much. And I'm thinking, well, that's good. And I said, George, have you ever heard the gospel, you know, like of Jesus, about how you can have eternal life? And he goes, oh, I heard, you know, a little bit of it here and there. I said, have any preachers that you know ever told you the gospel? Because preachers don't always share the gospel either, right? And he said, oh, you know, a little bit. And so then I said, well, to myself, not to George. I said to myself, now's the time to tell George a full gospel. And so the way I did is I used story, because George is always telling me stories, so I used story. So I went to John 3, where Nicodemus came to see Jesus. You remember that story? And Jesus tells him, you gotta be born again. And so I told him the whole story about Nicodemus coming, that Nicodemus was probably about the same age as George, that he was a very respected teacher in Israel, all that. And so how Jesus, he came at night, and how Jesus responded to him and stuff like that. And do you remember the fact that when Nicodemus came to Jesus, that Jesus was saying, you got to be born again? And do you remember the first question Nicodemus asked? He goes like, are you saying I got to go into my mother's womb again? You know, he was very literal, right? I mean, he had no idea what born again meant. He just took it physically. And so he wasn't following anything Jesus said. Jesus even told him he was the Son of Man. The Son of Man is a reference to Daniel 7:13-14. Nicodemus has the Old Testament memorized. He knows exactly who the Son of Man is. And Jesus tells him, if I tell you things about what's happening on earth and you don't understand them, how will you ever understand if I tell you about things in heaven? And then, with no clutch, he said, and as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so the Son of Man must be lifted up. And when Jesus said that, Nicodemus knew exactly what he was talking about. That was a reference to Numbers 21, where the children of Israel had been complaining after they came out of Egypt, and God sent fiery serpents among them. Remember that story? And how the children of Israel immediately realized, oh God, this is a plague from God. Moses, pray that God will take away the snakes. And God refused to take away the snakes. And instead, he told Moses, take some brass, craft it to look like one of these serpents, put it on a pole in the middle of the camp, and when anybody is bitten by a snake, if they'll look at that snake on the pole, they'll be healed. Well, I don't know about you, but that sounds like magic to me. Right? That doesn't sound like the gospel. That just sounds like magic. But this is the story Jesus is referencing. And so how many times did a snake-bit person have to look at the pole? And then Jesus said, as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so the Son of Man must be lifted up, that whoever believes in him will not perish, but have everlasting faith. 16, for God so loved the world. All right. To believe in Jesus is to take one look of faith. I'm snake dead. I need a Savior. And you look to Jesus. I don't know if you know it, but the Greek word for saved is sozo. And it's translated, more often it's translated to heal in the New Testament than it refers to salvation from hell to heaven. And so when Jesus is saying, you know, you'll be healed using that verse, he's actually referring to salvation, and then he tags it with the fact that he's going to die on the cross. I told George all of that story, knowing, I didn't ask him to believe anything, I didn't ask him to pray anything, I just wanted to make sure that George had actually heard a full gospel witness. And since that's what Jesus said to Nicodemus, I felt pretty safe that John 3 is a full gospel witness. And I left it at that way. And so 3 years after I bought the farm, I said, I finally had that conversation with George, and it was an easy conversation to have because of everything else that had gone before. Okay? Now I want to make my real point. That was all lead up to my real point. You can start small, slow down. You can start small. You can build trust. You can do, what did I say? What did 5 things? Here they are.
Like you.
Yeah. Start small, be humble, be patient. You can do all of those things. But now I want to say this to you. There's a 6th thing you have to do. None of those matter. None of those matter if you are a villain. And remember, George thinks most of the folks in the Baptist church are what? He thinks they're villains. I don't know if George is right. I haven't met anyone in the Baptist church in London. I'm not there. I'm a preacher in San Antonio, so I'm not there. But George thinks they're villains. He told me a story about 2 pastors. One tried to sell him a black horse. Nothing he said about that horse was true, and George said he's a liar. The second preacher story he told me was about a preacher that he knew that had gotten 7 women pregnant that were not his wife. That's what George thinks about preachers, and I am, right? And so he thinks we're villains. Y'all, nobody likes a villain. Nobody listens to a villain. Nobody believes a villain. Nobody wants to be like a villain. If you and I are villains, the gospel in our mouths sounds like hypocrisy. You don't believe a villain either. Whatever they tell you, forget faith. They could tell you about how to buy the next best whatever. You're not going to buy it if a villain says so, because you don't believe anything they say. So 1 through 5 does not matter if you and I are villains. The gospel only sounds like good news in the mouth of a hero. And Jesus was the ultimate hero. And that's why people who were nothing like Jesus liked Jesus. Everyone loves a hero. Now, what does it mean to be a hero? What does it mean to be like Jesus? How should you and I live if we want to live like Jesus? Well, one of the definitive passages in the New Testament about how Jesus lived was Ephesians 5, 1 through 2. Paul says this, "Be imitators of God as dearly loved children, and walk in love, as Christ loved us and gave himself for us." All right? There's a progression in this verse. The first thing Paul said to do is, if you want to live like Jesus, is he said, imitate God. But you know, if I tell you, hey, Paula, just imitate God. Well, that's kind of big, right? I mean, like, really, how do I do that? So Paul narrows it. He says, walk in love. Walk in love. And this word walk is a word that he's repeating 4 times in Ephesians 4 and 5. It's the outline for chapters 4 and 5 of how he's telling people, since they've been saved, how they should live. And he uses the Greek word peripateo, walk. And he uses it for the second time here. First he said walk in light. Now he's saying walk in love. Okay? And actually the first time he said walk no longer as the Gentiles do. Then he said walk in love. And after this he says walk in light. So he's telling them, hey, imitate God. If you want to know what that looks like, just walk in love. But even walk in love, live a life of love, is still pretty broad. Like, how do I do that? So he tells us the next progression. He says, just as Christ, and I'm going to use the Greek word kai, so don't take offense that I'm shortening his name on me. Just as Christ loved us and gave himself for us. Now, where did he give himself for us? Do you know where he did that? Yeah, that's cross, right? This is the cross. Okay, now, I want us to focus on this little word right here. This is the Greek word kai. And it's a conjunction. And we know how conjunctions work. Conjunctions join two things together, right? So I can say, I have my computer and my bag. And I've just joined these two things together. I have a computer and a bag. And that's what the word kai and usually means. It's joining together that Christ loved us and he gave himself for us. But there are times when the word kai is used in what grammarians call the assensive use of kai. And when it's the assensive use of kai, what you should do is you should use an equal sign. In other words, it would be like saying, I have my computer, which is also my bag. Now we know that this would not be an appropriate use of the word and here, right? Because a computer is not a bag. But there are times when two things are joined together by the word and they are actually the same thing. You following me? That's when you use the equal sign. This is one of them here. Imitate God, walk in love. How do I do that? Just as Christ loved us, which means he gave himself for us. It's the assensive use of kai. If you want to know what love is, if you want to know how to live like Christ, give your life away the way he gave his life away. Now this word right here, gave himself up for us, is the Greek word peridokin. Now it's used with a peridokin. It comes from the noun paradidomi. Or in English, it looks like this. Now, let me give you a little lesson on this. In the Gospels, most of the time, when this word is used of Jesus, it's used to refer to his arrest. His life was given over. He was arrested. It's literally translated arrested. Now, John, when you're arrested, are you surrendering yourself or are you being taken? You're being taken. Which means you're being taken and taken down to the jail or whatever, to the police station. It's happening to you. We call that passive. John is passively being taken down. Somebody else is doing something to him. Here, when it was used in the Gospels of Jesus, most of the time it's passive. It refers to his being arrested. But here, it's not passive. Here, it's active. This is John saying, I'm going to turn myself in down at the county jail. I'm going to give myself up, give myself over. Jesus, was he arrested passively or did he give his life up? Yeah, because what did he say? No man takes my life from me, right? I lay it down of my own accord. And so Jesus laid his life down by his own choice for us to save us from our sin. He gave his life away for the benefit of others, even at great cost to himself. That's the definition of a hero. A hero gives their life away for the benefit of others, even at great cost to themselves. And this is what it means to love. If you want to be a hero, you have to give your life away. Your list was absolutely right. And whenever you and I live as heroes, then we are living as fully devoted followers of Christ. And if you want people to like you the way they liked Jesus, then live like Jesus. And when they do, they are far more likely to hear the gospel from your mouth. Because everyone loves a hero. And so the first task for you and me, and I learned it from the farm, is if we want to have normal, effective faith conversations with people, our first task is people have to like us the way they like Jesus. And the way they'll do that is when you and I live like Jesus, which is exactly what Paul was telling us in Ephesians 5:2. This is the key to effectively sharing our faith. It means many, 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 many conversations. It means many times, perhaps, of laying your life down for the benefit of that other person, so that when the moment comes and you have a conversation, the gospel actually sounds like good news coming out of your mouth, not hypocrisy coming out of your mouth. And so those are the lessons from the farm. Okay, I've left you a negative 3 minutes to ask questions. What are your thoughts? Just popcorn them up. If you have one, don't make one up. It's practical. Thank you. What else? Can you do this? You can do this, right? You can actually give your life away. You know how to do that. In every situation, you can figure out, like, how do I give my life away? How do I love the way Jesus loved? It's not just to broadly say, oh, I'm going to love, but it's to actually give your life away the way Christ did. All right, there's a lot more I'd like to say. I'm not going to say. Anybody else have a thought? I got to let you go.
Well, let's say you presented yourself as genuine.
Yes.
You weren't phony with your friend George.
Yeah. Yeah. It didn't take 3 years for him to think I was genuine, but it took 3 years for the right moment to come up for the conversation, right? So when the conversation finally, when the moment arrived and it was pregnant, right, then I could have that conversation with no fear about what George was going to think when I spoke. We had faith on the table. It was a part of our conversation. George knew already I was the real deal. Hate to see y'all go because we won't get another neighbor like you. That's what that means. I'm telling you, I was not a good neighbor for 32 years of my life. I was a villain. I'm not making that up. You just ask John. But because of this change in me, and I didn't change until I discovered this, and I'm not even telling you, I told the last group how I discovered it, there's no time to tell you, but how I discovered this in myself, it allowed me to actually give my life. But for most of my life, I didn't. And so when people heard the gospel from me, it just didn't sound real. And so when it was time, it was easy with joy. Yeah.
I think
Yes, sir.
this is, we look for times where we can create an opportunity to witness somebody. This is just doing it.
Yes.
We've got those opportunities every day. Just depends on whether we do anything with it, or not, and we typically don't.
Yes. Have you nurtured them? Is it ready? Is it a natural flow of your life and conversation? Yes. Perfect. All right, Joe. Well, thank you. I'll let you go. Thanks for being a part of this. Yeah, appreciate it.